Greek philosophers valued a story about human beings. The story goes that human beings are like people in a deep, dark cave. They are chained, facing a wall, and behind them is a great fire. And between themselves and the fire is a road. And as various animals walk across that road, those chained facing the wall could see the reflection of the animals and beasts and humans on the wall. They could never see the real thing. They just saw puzzling reflections. Reminds one of St. Paul's statement that we see puzzling reflections in a mirror that one day face to face, in his great passage on love in 1 Corinthians 13. But in Christian thought, from time to time, the darkness in which we live is transfigured and changed by light, by blinding light. You say? Or words to that effect. We often think of Simon Peter as a young man. The young man who followed Jesus. A young man who was a less than reliable follower of Jesus, and yet the one called and anointed to be the head of the apostles. And yet towards the end of his life, when Peter either dictated what we call the second epistle of Peter, or perhaps later one of his followers wrote it up, what Peter remembers of all his experiences is rather curious. He doesn't talk about the time when Jesus called him and Peter and James and John. He doesn't talk about the day when Jesus said, "Who do people say that I am?" And Peter blurted out, "You are the Messiah, the Christ, the living one." He doesn't talk about Jesus being crucified or even the resurrection. He talks about a strange occurrence on a mountain. Well, not much of a mountain. Israel doesn't have great mountains like we find in parts of America. It has glorified hills. But anyway, Jesus took them up onto a hill. His favorite disciples, Peter, James, and John. And there something extraordinary happened. Now, why does Peter pick this up of all the stories of Jesus? Well, I think it's the one where he makes the least mistakes. You know, Peter had a propensity for putting his foot in it. That's why he's one of my favorite saints. Yes, he did proclaim that Jesus is the Son of God, and the next minute he was trying to get Jesus not to go to Jerusalem and be crucified, and Jesus said to him, "Get you behind me, Satan." Well, Peter doesn't want to remember that. And yes, he was there for the crucifixion, but he swore and cursed and denied that he knew Jesus, and then Jesus turned and looked on him. And Peter remembered that when he boasted he would never leave Jesus, Jesus said, "I tell you, before the cock crows you will deny me 3 times." Peter doesn't want to remember that. Peter doesn't particularly want to remember the resurrection, because after finding the empty tomb, he goes to Galilee, and there Jesus says to him the most hard words. Peter, do you love me? And all Peter can remember is his betrayal. You love me. But the one time when Peter nearly escapes putting his foot in it is when Jesus takes his favorite disciples up onto the hillside. And there something happens which is a sort of restatement of what happened to Moses in the Old Testament. All of a sudden, Peter, James, and John are talking to Jesus, and a huge light appears. And he seems to be talking to Moses and Elijah, the great heroes of the Old Testament. Moses, who had given the law on Mount Sinai, and when he had been given the law, he shone, as we heard in the first lesson this morning. And Elijah, who had brought Israel back to the truth by opposing that wretched old King Ahab and his wife Jezebel. And had gone to heaven at the call of the Lord. Resurrection. Now, why does Peter, years later, emphasize this? Peter says, we don't want you to believe fables. We don't want you to believe nonsense. But I was there. I saw what I saw. Now, you've got the scriptures. You've got the Old Testament, which were the scriptures. I don't believe a word of it. You've got the stories that are being circulated about Jesus by the church. You've got these things. But they're not for you to interpret by yourself. The worst kind of Bible study that I know is when everybody sits in a circle and the leader says, and what does this passage make you feel like? I always want to say, I'm bilious. Or something cruel. Or people who point to the Bible and says, well, it says there. Of course, it doesn't say a thing because the Bibles can't talk. And they put their own construction on what is there. And Peter is saying to the church years later, look, the scriptures are for your edification, but you have no right to try and interpret them by yourself. You have to interpret them through the light of Christ as it's given to the church. And he said, I saw that light, that visible light. Now, those who had been Greeks before they became Christians in the early church had an idea of what Peter was talking about. And it takes us back to the first story I told you. Plato. Have you ever heard of Plato? Pronouncing Plato. Because you can squeeze it into all sorts of shapes. Plato, who took what Socrates had said, poor old Socrates, who was executed for criticizing the state, and later it was expanded on by Aristotle. But all of them were trying to find something beyond their own gods. The Greek gods were a right lot, you know. They were more human than human. They made Hugh Hefner look like an acolyte. kind of one God. They didn't know who he was. A God who communicates. And they called that communication Logos. Word. Does that ring any bells? Beginning of St. John's Gospel, the first beginning. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. All things were made by him, and without him nothing was made that was made. And he's talking about Jesus. And yet the church, through the centuries, has also taken seriously something else those Greek law said that some of you had to study when you went to college. In a sense, they were right. We do live in darkness. And the trouble with us is that we think that darkness is reality. We think that those reflections on the wall of all that is around is reality. And we think that the things of God are not reality, or are somehow mysterious and supernatural. But what if, my dears, the things of God are natural and we are living subnaturally? Another take on the story about those people chained in this cave, who the fire reflects images on the cave wall, is that when they were released and got out of the cave, they could not bear the light. They could not bear the light. Peter thinks of that transfiguration that we keep today on the last Sunday before Lent as an anticipation of what we will all experience one day. When we stop living, of course we won't stop living because Jesus said we never die. But when we enter into the glorious light of heaven and are bathed with it, and we'll immediately reach for our sunglasses, the light of God's presence, to be out of shadowlands and into light, to be with Jesus and the saints and great Aunt Annie, who used to talk about her lumbago all the time. To be there, away from shadowlands and into glory. As the collect puts it today, taking a line from John Wesley, when we are changed from glory into glory, till in heaven we take our place. Peter remembers the light. His story is not at an end yet. When the great persecution of the Christians began under Nero, and that wicked old emperor who makes Colonel Gaddafi look like a primary school teacher, started to kill off the Christians. Peter, as usual, makes the wrong decision, or so legend tells us. He gets out of town. Well, after all, he is important, he's the bishop. The chief bishop of the church can't do without bishops, can we? And then he sees a vision of Jesus carrying his cross towards Rome. Domine quo vadis, Lord, where are you going? Jesus says, I am going to die in your place, Peter. And Peter turns round and goes back to Rome and refuses to be crucified as his Lord. He is crucified upside down to show his unworthiness. And his remains are under that great basilica of St. Peter's in Rome to this day. The big fisherman, full of bluster, full of self-confidence, and constantly making the wrong choice. Isn't he delicious? Does he remind you of anybody? I cling to Peter. I think if Peter can get into heaven, then I've got a chance. The light. And here we are in this lovely church this morning. And if you look around with the eyes of faith, you see the light. And if you look at the altar of God, the God of our joy and gladness, you see the light. And as you come and receive Jesus into your hearts and into your lives, for a moment the light possesses you and drives out all darkness and makes all things well. And so that is the message for the Sunday before Lent. By the way, if you look at the parish website, those of you who have computers, those of you who have old ones, fill them with kerosene and try and look at them. You will see a sermon that I wrote for the Episcopal Church, which has some practical suggestions for Lent. And I will quickly recapitulate them now. Don't think about what you're going to give up. Lent is not some kind of New Year's resolution with a holy face. If you try that, you'll do as well as you do with your New Year's resolutions. First place to look to see what you should do with Lent is your parish church. What is the parish church, that is you together, doing for Lent? Well, it's not giving up, it's adding. It's adding every Wednesday at stations, followed by an address. Occasionally, there may be even something to eat, but we're not going to make a habit of it this Lent. Lent isn't the time of parties. We'll do it round about St. Patrick's Day as a relief. If you insist on eating for Lent, it will be bread and gruel. What is the church doing for Lent? It's adding. It's walking with Jesus as we go from station to station. Now, what can I do at home that makes that my own? A, I can come to stations. I know it may upset your dinner appointments on Wednesday or something like that, but try. It's only half an hour. Secondly, at home, if you can't come to church, I'm sure we can find a copy of the stations for you to do at home. You can do it seated in your favourite chair. Secondly, may I suggest that you pray intentionally and specially during Lent for this parish, for its growth and for God's blessing. And thirdly, ask the person closest to you what your worst sin is. And then offer that sin to God daily. You could write it on something and put it on the refrigerator. There's no need to say it's yours. Remember. And if you don't know what it is, as I say, there's plenty of people who will tell you what it is. Work on it. So that when Easter comes, the light will have dispelled the darkness, and you will be ready to rejoice in our risen Lord. Amen.